The sun hung low above the plains, a swollen ember pressed against the horizon, bleeding its fire into a sky stretched taut with dust and silence. The wind, restless and dry, dragged its skirts across the prairie grass, lifting small spirals of grit that danced and died in the same breath. Heat shimmered on the earth, bending fence posts and distant hills into wavering ghosts. The land breathed in long, weary sighs, as if even the soil itself ached beneath the weight of summer's merciless hand. Colton Hartwell stood on the porch of his ranch house, the boards beneath his boots creaking with the sound of a man who had known this place longer than most men knew themselves. His shoulders, broad as barn doors, filled the frame of the doorway. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, carried the stillness of a man more at ease with animals than with people. To the town of Dry Creek, he was the giant rancher, a man too large for small talk, too strong to be gentle, too quiet to be fully trusted. He let the nickname settle on him like dust on a saddle. There was no brushing it off, and he did not try. Beyond the corral, the stable doors groaned open and Jessamine Rourke emerged into the slant of the dying light. She was small beside the horizon, a dark figure moving slowly beneath the weight of 2 buckets of water. Her arms trembled, not with weakness but with a stubborn will to keep going, to prove she belonged here among the grit and sweat of ranch work. She paused at the trough, lowered the buckets with a dull splash, and leaned against the rough post, her head bowed as though the earth itself tugged her downward. Colton's gaze lingered on her hands. Even from the porch, he could see the raw blisters, angry and red against her skin, the flesh worn down by rope and shovel and reins. She flexed her fingers once, twice, as if debating whether to scream or simply keep moving. She chose silence. There had been talk when she first arrived 3 weeks past. A woman in the stables, alone, unmarried, 30 years old and stubborn as a mule, such a thing was bound to stir tongues in Dry Creek. They called her fragile, called her foolish, called her something worse when the whiskey loosened their mouths. But every dawn she returned to the barns, her skirts dusty, her hair tied back in a knot that refused elegance, her hands doing the work meant for men who now watched her from the safety of tavern chairs. Colton remembered the first time he'd seen her step down from the wagon, clutching a carpet bag more frayed than full. She hadn't looked at him, not directly, but he had seen the mark of shame across her posture, the straight back that bent just slightly under the invisible load of judgment. He had not asked her story. He never asked stories. A man with his own ghosts learned not to pry at the wounds of others. Now, as she lifted the buckets again, he noticed the slight tremor in her wrists. The weight was too much. She stumbled, spilling a dark trail of water onto the thirsty dirt. Colton's chest tightened at the sight, though his face betrayed nothing. He shifted once on his boots, almost stepped forward, then stilled himself. His size had frightened women before. His shadow had ruined softer moments. Better to remain unseen than risk making her feel smaller than she already did. Jessamine set the buckets down again, breathing hard, pressing her palms against her skirt to hide the shaking. When she lifted her head, her eyes caught the last light of dusk, and for an instant Colton thought he saw defiance, like the stubborn glint of a star refusing to be swallowed by night. She turned toward the stables, swallowed by the dark frame of the doorway, leaving the buckets behind. The prairie settled into evening, coyotes calling from the ridges, crickets stitching their endless hymn. Colton stepped down from the porch at last, his boots crunching against the brittle earth. He moved toward the buckets she had abandoned. His hand wrapped around the iron handle, the weight of the water barely a burden to him. Still, he carried it slowly, careful as if it were something fragile. At the trough, he poured the last of it in, the ripples catching the first scatter of stars above. He stood there a moment longer, the smell of hay and horse sweat drifting from the stables, the echo of her weary footsteps fading deeper into shadow. He thought of the blisters again, raw against rope and wood, a body breaking itself to prove its worth to a world eager to laugh at its failings. His own palms itched at the memory of rope burns from years past, of calluses that told the story of a man who had built walls with his hands and around his heart. From inside the stable came the sound of her voice, soft and low, speaking not to him but to the horses. "Easy now," she murmured, her tone carrying the hush of someone who had learned gentleness by way of hardship. The mare nickered in response, and Jessamine's words slipped into laughter, brief but startling against the silence. Colton turned back toward the house, the sound following him like a lantern swinging in the dark. For the first time in months he felt the air shift, not cooler, not softer, but different, as though some thread of the world had been pulled taut and was waiting to be tied or broken. The night thickened. In the distance, a single coyote call broke into 2, then 3. Colton paused at his door, looking once more toward the stables. Inside, her lantern cast a faint glow across the slats, spilling thin golden stripes into the darkness. His gaze lingered until the light wavered. Then, slowly it went out. The rancher remained there, silent against the night, aware of the choice before him, whether to remain the man who kept his distance, or to step into the quiet battle unfolding within those wooden walls. And as the first whip of cool wind swept across the prairie, he felt something shift deep inside, something he had long buried. The decision, though unspoken, began to take root. The saloon in Dry Creek wore the dusk like a second skin, lamplight pushing against the smoke-laden air, laughter clattering against the piano's weary keys. Men leaned on bar stools with their spurs jingling like mocking bells, their voices pitched just high enough for every ear to catch the barbed edge of their words. It was here, in this dusty cavern of drink and gossip, that Jessamine Rourke's name was carried like a feather caught in a whirl of wind, passed from mouth to mouth until it no longer resembled the truth, if truth had ever been sought at all. "Don't make sense," muttered Deputy Rance Calloway, his badge catching the glow of the oil lamp as he leaned on the counter. "A woman tend in horses out at Hartwell's place. Ain't proper. Ain't natural. Ain't safe neither," added Ezekiel Crowder, his grin curling into something sharp. "Man like Hartwell, giant as a grizzly temper to match, and her all delicate blisters and all. Folks'll talk. Already are." Widow Belle McGraw, perched like a raven on her favorite corner stool, fanned herself with deliberate slowness. "Delicate? She don't look delicate to me. She looks desperate. A woman that age alone talking to ranch work. Well, what else is she running from?" Their laughter spread like spilled whiskey across the room, warm at first, then bitter in its aftertaste. Each word carved its place in the dust, ready to be carried back to the one they mocked. Jessamine heard them the next morning. She had come into town for supplies, a list folded neatly in her pocket though her coins were fewer than she'd admit. She passed the saloon doors just as the talk spilled into the street, their careless laughter scattering like crows before her. She did not stop, did not raise her eyes, but the heat crawled up her neck all the same. Her boots moved quickly across the boardwalk, yet the words clung to her like burrs in a hem, delicate, desperate, running. Inside her chest, something hollow shifted. She had known ridicule before, it was no stranger. But here, among people she hoped might look upon her work and see worth, the sting burrowed deeper. Still, she pressed on, her hands curled into fists inside her skirt pockets, the blisters burning against the rough fabric as though reminding her of what she carried. Back at the ranch, she sought refuge in the stables. The smell of hay, horse sweat, and leather wrapped around her like a worn blanket. She busied herself with a young foal, stroking its trembling flank, whispering small comforts. "Hush now, you're not alone," she murmured, though her voice quavered with the weight of words meant as much for herself as for the animal. The foal leaned into her hand, and in that moment, the ache in her chest softened, if only by a fraction. Colton Hartwell stood in the shadow of the barn, unseen but listening. He had gone there for a bridle, but her voice halted him. The quiet conviction in it, the gentleness shaped by grit, it stirred something he had not felt in years. He had heard the gossip too, though he never lingered long enough in town to invite more than a glance. Their words did not surprise him. He had been a target himself long ago, and had learned how quickly rumor swells into judgment. But hearing her bear the weight of it in silence, watching her soothe the foal even as her own spirit frayed, made the old walls around his heart shift uneasily. Later, he left a small tin of salve on the bench where she kept her tools. He did not hand it to her. He had no wish to watch pride wrestle with gratitude. Instead, he placed it there quietly, as though it had always belonged among her brushes and cloths. That evening he found the tin gone. He said nothing, and so did she. But the next day, her hands bore neat white bandages, and something in her shoulders seemed a shade less burdened. The days unfolded with their slow rhythm, chores, sweat, the creak of wood and leather. Yet the undercurrent of town gossip wound tighter around them, an invisible rope pulling at every silence between them. Jessamine bore it outwardly with calm, but in the stillness of the night, lying awake beneath the roof of her small quarters, she felt the words gnaw at her ribs. She wondered how long before the whispers reached a pitch loud enough to drive her out. Perhaps she should leave before that happened. Perhaps her place was never here. One afternoon, as the sun scorched the earth into a glare of gold and white, she strained to lift a pail of water. Her palms screamed with pain, the blisters raw even beneath the bandages. The bucket slipped, splashing mud across her skirts. She froze, humiliation clamping her throat. From the corner of her eye, she saw one of the ranch hands, Crowder again, leaning against a fence post, smirking as though the scene were a private joke delivered for his amusement. "Figure this kind of work ain't for you, miss," he drawled. "Best leave the ranch in to them as know how. Ain't no shame in quittin' before you break." His words struck sharper than the gossip in town, for they were flung straight into her face. Jessamine's breath hitched, but she did not answer. She turned back to the trough, gathering what dignity she could from the steady act of filling it again. Crowder chuckled, kicked the dirt with his heel, and sauntered away, his laughter trailing behind like a rattler's warning. Colton had seen enough. From where he worked near the barn he walked toward the trough, each step slow, deliberate, heavy. He did not speak. He did not need to. Crowder caught sight of him and paled, the smirk dissolving. Colton's silence bore more weight than a shout, his looming presence enough to strip the air of Crowder's bravado. With a muttered excuse, the man disappeared toward the bunkhouse. Jessamine stood frozen, the bucket still in her grip. She expected rebuke, perhaps pity, but Colton only bent, took the handle from her hand and set the pail on the trough with ease. Then he stepped back, his eyes steady, his jaw set against words that might have been too clumsy on his tongue. He turned and walked away, leaving her with nothing but the echo of his unspoken defense. That night, as Jessamine sat alone in her quarters, she unwrapped the bandages and pressed the salve gently into her palms. She thought of his silence, of the way it had shielded her without stripping her pride. Her hands throbbed, but the pain felt altered, softened by something she could not yet name. Outside, the prairie wind rose, carrying the faint chorus of coyotes across the dark. Jessamine blew out her lamp, lying awake with her blistered hands tucked beneath her cheek. She could still feel the weight of his presence beside her at the trough, a wordless barrier between her and the cruelty of others. And though she told herself it was nothing, only duty, only decency, the memory burned brighter than she wished to admit. The town's whispers still clung to her, sharp as thorns. But now another whisper, quieter, took root within her, a question she could not yet bring herself to answer. By dawn, the horizon burned with the color of embers, and the dust rose again on the wind. Jessamine tightened her bandages, gathered her strength, and stepped out to meet the day, unaware that Dry Creek's gossip had only begun to sharpen, and that its next strike would cut deeper than any blister on her hands. The summer deepened, stretching its furnace heat across the plains until even the stones seemed to sweat. Days lengthened into a shimmering haze, the air heavy with the scent of dust and sun-baked grass. On the Hartwell Ranch, work continued in its steady rhythm, each task demanding sweat, each silence carrying the weight of words unsaid. It was in that silence that Colton and Jessamine began to shape a language of their own, built not of syllables but of small, deliberate acts. One morning, Jessamine wrestled with the stable door, its hinge stubborn with rust. She pressed her shoulder against it, teeth clenched, the strain pulling sweat along her brow. The wood groaned but refused to yield. At last, she dropped the mallet in frustration, breath catching hard in her throat. When she returned at dusk, the hinge no longer cried in protest. The door swung smooth as creek water, the bolts replaced, the wood planed and steady. No one had claimed the work, but she knew. The realization carried a strange warmth that spread beneath her ribs, though she told herself it was nothing more than courtesy. Later that week, she noticed his shirt, frayed at the shoulder seam, the threads unraveling from hard use. She stitched it in secret during the cool stretch of evening, her fingers nimble despite the sting of healing blisters. She folded it carefully and left it on the chair by his door. The next day, Colton wore it without a word. But when his path crossed hers in the barn, his gaze lingered on her just long enough for her to feel it brush against her like the whisper of a hand not quite touching. These quiet exchanges gathered between them like stacked kindling, dry, waiting for spark. Neither rushed. Neither named it. Yet the air grew taut with a presence neither could ignore. The world beyond the ranch, however, pressed in with sharper edges. Ezekiel Crowder returned to his mutterings, his sly remarks floating among the other ranch hands. Though he did not dare confront Jessamine outright again, his smirk followed her movements as though waiting for her to falter. She held her head high, but each time she crossed paths with him, her heart tightened. Pride alone kept her hand steady on the reins or shovel. One evening, as the prairie simmered beneath a swollen purple sky, the storm came. Clouds gathered low and restless, and thunder rumbled like a drum against the earth's hollow chest. Jessamine was in the pasture when the first strike split the heavens. Horses screamed, hooves pounding the ground in panic. She ran toward them without thought, skirts tangling against her legs, voice breaking into commands. But the herd, spooked by the jagged fire of the sky, bolted against the fence. Colton was already there, his frame a shadow cut against the flashing horizon. He moved with a swiftness that belied his size, his hands catching reins, his voice deep and steady, the kind of sound that calmed beasts even as lightning tore the air. Together they fought the chaos, Jessamine's palms raw against rope, Colton's arms braced against the wild surge of muscle and fear. Rain burst open above them, soaking cloth and skin until both were plastered in mud and sweat. Jessamine's hands slipped. The ropes scorched fresh fire into her palms, and the mare reared, nearly throwing her. She gasped, bracing herself, when Colton's arm closed around her wrist. For the first time, his touch was not accidental, not restrained. His grip was firm yet careful, his voice pitched low through the storm. "Enough," he said, the word cutting through thunder. "Let me." She wanted to protest, to prove herself unbroken, but the sight of her bleeding palms silenced her. He bound the rope in one hand, leading the mare with a calmness that stilled its frenzy. Jessamine stumbled back, the rain disguising the hot blur of tears that pricked her eyes, not weakness, but the unbearable relief of being momentarily shielded. When the herd at last quieted, they stood together in the lantern's dim glow within the stable. Rain hammered the roof above, water dripping from their clothes in steady streams. Jessamine cradled her hands, the blisters torn open anew, blood mixing with the salve's faint shine. Colton reached for her wrists, and though instinct urged her to pull away, something in his steady gaze rooted her in place. His fingers were rough, calloused with years of labor, yet when they touched her skin, the gentleness was almost unbearable. He wrapped her palms in strips of cloth, winding them slowly, his head bowed in concentration. Jessamine watched the rainwater slide down his jaw, the candlelight softening the hard planes of his face. He said nothing, but in the silence she heard more than words could carry: patience, respect, a quiet recognition of her pain. She found herself speaking to fill the hush. "They'll say I don't belong. They already do." He tied the bandage, snug but not cruel, then looked at her at last. His eyes, shadowed beneath his wet hair, held something she could not name. "Let them talk," he murmured, his voice like gravel smoothed by water. "Dust don't stick if you keep moving. The words, simple as they were, struck deep. She had expected pity or dismissal, but what she found was kinship, spoken in a tongue she thought long forgotten. For the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, she did not feel entirely alone. They sat in silence after, the storm rattling against the walls, the lantern flickering. Jessamine traced the edge of the bandage with her thumb, marveling at how the pain had quieted, how the simple act of his hands over hers had shifted the weight she carried. When dawn broke, the world outside gleamed washed and new, the prairie scrubbed clean by the night's rage. Jessamine stepped into the light with her hands bound, her shoulders straighter. Colton was already in the yard, repairing the fence splintered by the storm. He did not look up when she passed, yet she felt his awareness, a tether invisible but sure. Days after, their wordless exchanges deepened. She left coffee by his tools. He replaced a broken handle on her shovel. Each gesture carried more weight than either dared speak aloud. And yet, like a horizon always just out of reach, the space between them held both promise and peril. But the world beyond their quiet covenant did not rest. At the edge of the corral one evening, Crowder leaned against the post again, his eyes mean, his grin sly. Jessamine met his gaze this time, refusing to look away. His smirk widened, but before he could speak, Colton's shadow fell across him, silent as always. Crowder straightened, the smirk faltering under the giant's unblinking stare. For a long moment, no words passed. Then Crowder spat into the dirt, muttered something low and slunk away. Jessamine exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath. Colton turned toward her, his expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, she thought he might say something more, might finally break the silence between them. But instead he simply tipped his hat and walked back toward the barn. She stood rooted, her palms tingling beneath their wrappings, her heart caught in the space his words had not filled. The evening wind carried the scent of rain still clinging to the earth, a reminder of storms past and storms yet to come. In that silence, Jessamine felt the shape of a choice beginning to take form. A choice that would demand more than endurance, more than silence. And though she could not yet see where it would lead, she knew the next storm would not be weather alone, but something far fiercer, rising from the hearts of men. The heat in Dry Creek carried with it more than dust. It bore the weight of suspicion, the kind that clung to shoulders and whispered in every pause between footsteps. Jessamine felt it first when she entered town with her basket balanced against her hip, the air thick with unspoken words. The general store, once merely a place of transaction, had become a chamber of judgment. Eyes slid toward her as though she trailed scandal behind her skirts. Even the scales seemed to measure more than sugar and flour, as if weighing her worth and finding it lacking. The murmurs had swelled since the storm, since the night when she and Colton had been seen together beneath the violent sky, his towering shadow beside her, his hand binding her wounds. Rumor, like rain, seeped through every crack, and soon even the sheriff found cause to lean his presence against it. Sheriff Dalton Graves was a man carved from the same brittle timber as the town itself, upright, weathered, keen-eyed. He appeared at the mercantile doorway, his boots echoing against the boards, his gaze fastening on Jessamine with the slow precision of a nail hammered into wood. "Miss Rourke," he said, his voice neither kind nor cruel, only heavy. "A word, if you please." She followed him outside, the sun striking hard against her brow. The boardwalk beneath her boots vibrated faintly with the murmur of those who leaned forward to listen. Dalton rested his hands on his belt, thumbs hooked near his holster, not as threat but as habit. "There's talk," he began. "Talk that your presence out at Hartwell's place is stirring unrest. Town don't take kindly to things it don't understand." Her lips parted, but no answer came. Shame rose in her throat like dust choking her lungs. He studied her a moment longer. "You'd be wise to consider how much longer you plan on staying. The words fell like stones. She lowered her gaze, then turned without reply, her basket clutched tight. The sheriff did not call after her. He had said his piece, and in Dry Creek, the warning of a lawman was the nearest thing to judgment handed down from the sky itself. By the time she returned to the ranch, the prairie wind had risen, carrying the hiss of cicadas across the fields. She found Colton in the barn, mending tack with his quiet precision. He looked up once, and though his eyes searched hers, she could not bear to meet them. She passed him in silence, retreating to her quarters, where the four walls seemed suddenly too narrow, too loud with the echo of voices that would not leave her be. That night she sat awake, lantern dim, fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. She thought of the words, "Consider how much longer you plan on staying." The notion of leaving coiled inside her like a rattler ready to strike. Would absence silence the town? Would her departure free Colton from the stain of her presence? The thought hollowed her chest, yet seemed inevitable. Days later the town meeting was called. It was meant to discuss irrigation, but as the benches filled and the air thickened with sweat and tobacco, the matter of Jessamine and Hartwell bled into every exchange. Widow McGraw, ever sharp-tongued, fanned herself as she declared, "It ain't proper, a woman livin' under a man's roof without bond or blood between 'em. Makes the whole town look lawless." Crowder added fuel, his grin sly. "A stable woman she may call herself, but we all know what kind of stable some women keep." The laughter that followed was brittle, eager, cruel. Jessamine sat at the edge of the hall, her body rigid, her nails digging crescent moons into her palms. She had come only to hear the talk of water rights, yet now she was the subject, her life unwrapped like some sordid spectacle. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the drone of voices. She wanted to stand, to speak, but the words shriveled before reaching her lips. Then Colton rose. His size alone was enough to still the room. The benches groaned as men shifted uneasily, the scrape of boots loud in the hush. He did not raise his voice, he had no need. "That woman has worked harder than most men here," he said, his tone flat, each word a stone laid steady. "She tends my horses, keeps to her own, and harms no one. You shame yourselves with this talk." A ripple of discontent stirred. Some lowered their gazes. Others bristled. Widow McGraw pursed her lips. "You'd defend her then, Hartwell? Make her your cause?" His jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, Jessamine thought he might falter. But his gaze swept the room, steady and unyielding. "I defend fairness. That's all." The meeting dissolved soon after, the talk of water forgotten, the gossip left simmering beneath the surface like coals under ash. Jessamine left before Colton could catch her eye, her heart split between gratitude and humiliation. His defense had spared her further cruelty, yet it had also cemented her as the center of the town's scorn. She found herself at the edge of the prairie that evening, where the tall grass bowed beneath the wind, endless and restless. The sky above stretched wide and merciless, colors bruising into dusk. Here at least the voices of men could not reach her. She pressed her hands to her face, fighting the tears that burned hot with shame. Footsteps approached, slow, heavy, deliberate. She did not turn. "I should go," she said, her voice breaking against the vastness. "They're right. I don't belong here. My staying only harms you." Silence stretched. When at last he spoke, Colton's voice was low, weighted with memory. "You think I don't know what it is bein' talked about? Watched every step like a beast in a cage? They called me a monster, Jessamine. Called my strength a curse. My wife, she believed them. She let their words turn her heart cold. I buried her and never set foot in town without feeling their stares. Still don't. His confession fell into the dusk like a stone into deep water, rippling outward. Jessamine lowered her hands, turning to face him. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, shadowed beneath his hat, yet she saw the rawness in his words, the scar of years carried in silence. "They'll never stop talking," he said. "Not about me. Not about you. But talk don't break us unless we let it." Something shifted in her then, not the vanishing of shame but the slow birth of defiance. She had come to Dry Creek to outrun whispers of her past, only to stumble into new ones. But in Colton's presence she felt the possibility of standing not as fugitive, but as woman unbroken. They walked back toward the ranch together, the prairie wind at their backs, the darkness closing around them like a cloak. Neither spoke further, but their silence was no longer heavy with isolation. It carried instead the weight of shared survival, of two lives bruised by judgment yet unbowed. Still the town did not rest. Rumors twisted sharper, fueled by Crowder's bitterness and the widow's restless tongue. By week's end, stories of scandal painted across her name spread through every corner of Dry Creek. Children repeated them in play. Men repeated them over poker hands. And by the time Sunday bells rang, the preacher's sermon skirted close enough to her story that she felt every word pierce her like a nail. That evening, returning from town, Jessamine paused at the edge of the corral. Lantern light spilled from the stable where Colton worked, the glow steady against the gathering dark. She watched him move, slow, deliberate, shoulders bent to labor, and felt her resolve harden. She would not run. She would not surrender her place here, not while her hands still bore the proof of toil. But as she turned toward her quarters, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow slipping along the fence line, a figure pausing where lantern light thinned into black. The glint of a smile she knew too well curved in the dark, cruel and patient. Crowder. Jessamine froze, the night air tightening around her chest. He lingered only a moment before melting back into shadow, but the look in his eyes, hungry, vindictive, left no doubt. The town's judgment had turned crueler than words, and its next strike would not be gossip but something far more dangerous. The night pressed close around the ranch, heavy with a silence that was not peace but anticipation. The air had cooled from the blistering heat of the day, yet a restlessness threaded through the prairie, the kind of tension that sets dogs to whining and horses to shifting uneasily in their stalls. Jessamine lay in her narrow bed, her hands folded beneath her cheek, unable to find rest. She kept seeing Crowder's grin lingering in the shadows, the promise of malice in his eyes. The town's judgment had already bruised her spirit, but what she had glimpsed last evening spoke of something darker than words. Sleep fled entirely when the faint crackle of fire reached her ears. At first she thought it the wind fussing against the barn, but then came the unmistakable scent, sharp, acrid, hungry. She sat bolt upright, heart clenching. A glow pulsed through the thin curtain, not moonlight but the throbbing orange of flames. By the time she reached the door, the night had erupted. Fire licked along the lower beams of the stable, smoke boiling upward. Horses shrieked in panic, their hooves pounding like drums of war. Jessamine's cry tore free from her throat, but her voice was drowned beneath the roar of the flames. She ran barefoot across the yard, skirts catching sparks, hair loose about her shoulders. Colton was already there, silhouetted against the inferno, his giant frame moving with frightening swiftness. He wrenched open the stable doors, smoke rolling out in choking waves. The animals thrashed, blinded by terror, and he stepped into the chaos without hesitation. His hands caught reins, his voice deep and unshaken as he urged the horses toward the open air. One by one they burst into the yard, wild-eyed, steam rising off their bodies as they galloped free. Jessamine plunged in beside him, eyes stinging, throat raw. She seized the halter of a trembling mare, coaxing it out with murmured reassurances even as her lungs screamed for air. Together they fought against the fury of the fire, each animal wrested from the grip of smoke and flame. Her hands burned, old wounds tearing open, but she did not falter. The thought of surrender, of running, never crossed her mind. It was Crowder who had done this. She felt it as surely as she felt the heat blistering her skin. His malice had found its form in fire, the town's whispered judgment made flesh in destruction. The weight of their scorn had become tinder and Crowder the match. And now, if she failed all she had fought to prove, every drop of sweat, every wound upon her palms, would vanish into ash. At last the stall stood nearly empty, save for one colt pressed into the far corner, eyes rolling white. Jessamine staggered toward it, the smoke suffocating, her vision narrowing to a tunnel of flickering flame. She reached the colt, pressed her body against its trembling flank, and pulled hard on the halter. It resisted, terrified, rearing and nearly throwing her into the fire. Then Colton's arms were there, wrapping around both horse and woman, his strength gathering them up and forcing them through the doorway. They stumbled into the cool night air, the colt bolting free. Jessamine collapsed to her knees, coughing until blood speckled her lips. Colton dropped beside her, one arm bracing her as the barn roared behind them. Sparks soared into the sky, carried upward like condemned souls. The ranch that had stood so solid now quivered on the edge of ruin. And then, through the haze, came voices. The townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the glow. Men and women spilled across the yard, faces lit by firelight. Their mouths, once so quick with gossip, hung open in silence as they watched the scene unfold. The woman they had mocked, her hands blackened, her lungs torn by smoke, standing shoulder to shoulder with the giant rancher, saving what could still be saved. Widow McGraw was among them, her fan forgotten in her hand. Even she could not mask the astonishment in her eyes. Deputy Calloway muttered something low, his gaze avoiding Colton's for the first time in memory. Jessamine rose, unsteady but unbroken, her hair tangled with ash, her face streaked with soot and tears. She did not look at them. Her eyes found only Colton, and in them burned a quiet, unspoken vow. She had stood in the fire, and still she stood now. The flames devoured the barn until only a skeleton of blackened beams remained. The night air cooled, the roar subsiding into crackling ruin. The horses, safe in the pasture, blew steam into the darkness. The townsfolk lingered, waiting perhaps for some scandal, some shame to justify all the words they had spoken. But none came. Instead, Colton straightened, towering above them, his face smeared with soot but his gaze steady. He looked not at the crowd but at Jessamine, his hand reaching for hers. She placed her blistered palm in his without hesitation, scars against scars, silence against silence. The gesture spoke louder than any declaration. The crowd saw it, the quiet covenant sealed not in words but in fire and survival. For the first time they did not laugh. They did not whisper. They only watched, their judgment cracked open by the sight of dignity forged in smoke. Jessamine lifted her chin, her eyes sweeping across them all. She did not speak, yet her defiance filled the yard like a hymn. In her stillness they saw the truth, not scandal, not shame, but strength that would not bend beneath their weight. When the last ember sank into ash, the townsfolk began to drift away, their silence louder than any sermon. The ranch still stood, scarred but unbroken, and so too did those who called it home. Colton turned to Jessamine, his voice husky from smoke. "You should rest." Her lips curved, faint and weary. "So should you." The exchange, small and unadorned, carried the fullness of everything left unsaid. They walked back toward the house together, their shadows cast long against the earth, a lantern swinging between them. Its flame, though small, burned steady against the night. And as Jessamine crossed the threshold, she knew the town's judgment had lost its hold. Fire had stripped her bare, but in the ruin she had found something fiercer than shame, brighter than gossip. She had found her place, not because it was given, but because she had claimed it, hand in hand with the man who saw her not as fragile or desperate, but as equal, as enduring. The prairie wind sighed through the blackened beams, carrying sparks into the stars. Somewhere in that dark, Crowder slunk unseen, his failure seething. The battle was not ended, but the tide had turned. Jessamine closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her down, yet within her chest glowed a steadiness that no fire could consume. For though the night had tried to swallow her, she had stepped through its flames and carried a lantern out the other side. And the light it cast would not be easily extinguished. How did you find my story? Did the dust, the fire, and the quiet gestures speak to you the way I hoped? Did you feel the pain, the silence, and the light breaking through judgment, carrying you into the hearts of Colton and Jessamine as if you walked beside them on the prairie?